Thanks, Daniel. And thanks to Labour CND. Obviously, I am part of Labour CND, but still great to be hosting this webinar tonight, and appreciate the time given to this. As Daniel just said, I'm going to open with a quick overview of the pamphlet, which of course we hope after this, if you've not read it already and bought a copy, you'll go away and do, and help promote. But yeah, we published this last year ahead of the Labour Party conference, and whilst I'm named as the lead author on the pamphlet, I think I should and certainly do want to acknowledge the contribution of all members of the Labour CND Executive Committee who helped certainly improve the pamphlet and shape it into a resource which we hope will be useful in terms for anti-nuclear activists to use in the debate around nuclear power. And it's this debate which really lies behind the reason for why we wanted to write this pamphlet, and primarily the Labour Party policy to support nuclear power as a response to questions of energy security and, above all, climate change. And unfortunately, alongside the fossil fuel lobby, nuclear power enjoys its own significant backing, including within trade unions and the wider Labour movement, and something which I don't think we have sort of reminded in the pamphlet, but I just wanted to go back to, was at the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, which seemed an age ago now, but where unions issued a joint statement saying that the climate fight needs nuclear and that we should not be cowed by outdated prejudice and pickled dogmas that would have us abandon nuclear. Now, that was obviously intended to be a particularly provocative statement at the COP climate talks, and I think for those who were in Glasgow saw the heavy presence of the nuclear lobby around the climate talks as well. But I think what it does is it undermines the very real and serious arguments against nuclear power based on around 70 years of experience of it. This isn't something that, you know, we're just coming to look at from a decade ago. We have a long time where we know of its dangers and its threats. But so as an introduction to the pamphlet, in the face of the two biggest threats to humanity, climate change and nuclear war, we set out that we're putting the argument that nuclear power that there is no argument that nuclear power can rescue us, and that it's false and dangerous to support that position. And the pamphlet really starts from the premise of the conclusion arrived at by Tony Benn, who was, of course, a former Minister for Technology and Energy within the Labour government, who went from being a passionate supporter of nuclear power, or atoms for peace, as it's been called, to saying in 2008 that nothing in the world would now induce me to support nuclear power. It was a mistake. And why? Because, as Tony Benn discovered, nuclear power is not safe, is not cheap, and certainly not peaceful. And yet this seems to be a mistake we're set on repeating, as nuclear power is once again being touted as the solution to energy security and decarbonisation. So we've therefore started in the pamphlet with trying to obviously illustrate the extent of the climate crisis and the threat of climate catastrophe that we're saying, which we're seeing at the moment. And even since we've written the pamphlet, so around the autumn of last year, this is a crisis which is deepening and actually getting far worse, and I think, than what many people are kind of realizing. And in January, the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that 2023 was the warmest on record by a huge margin, approaching the 1.5 degrees of warming threshold, which is enshrined in the Paris Climate Agreement. And as the UN keep consistently saying, we are not breaking records, we are shattering records all over the place, whether it's just on increased heat, whether it's rising sea levels, glacier melt, across the board. And you may well have seen last week a Guardian survey of climate experts that said this target, so the 1.5 degrees target, is now unreachable. With one South African scientist saying, "I expect a semi-dystopian future with substantial pain and suffering for the people of the global South. The world's response to date is reprehensible. We live in an age of fools." And I think that's a very poignant statement, because when we also think about nuclear power as well within that context, it goes back to this idea about, you know, we are replicating the mistake of something we've already got vast experience on. But as we go on to say in the pamphlet, one of the problems with this, and I think it's one of the points made by some of the scientists as well about this whole targets of 1.5 degrees, this debate is very much caught up within the electoral politics, both of the Labour Party and obviously the Tory Party rolling back on their green policies. And certainly for the Labour Party and the Green Prosperity Plan and the policy for a fairer, greener future in favour of fiscal rules over what climate scientists are telling us, and the need to stand on the basis of credible climate policy. So rather than, you know, Rachel Reeves's speeches around secure economics, as she's termed it, the Labour Party see no contradiction in their unwavering support for nuclear power as a critical part of the UK's energy mix. And again, as we go on to highlight in the pamphlet, it's not always been the position of the Labour Party, and it was just 20 years ago when, under the Labour Party's Sustainable Development Commission, who voiced the same concerns that we had today, that they determined we did not need nuclear power, and the Labour Party was not supporting that. But there was a sudden U-turn under the Blair government, and thanks to Phil Johnson, his colleague Andy Sterling, have really gone on to highlight, you know, and dig down into the research of why there was such a U-turn at that time. And I think we can only understand that, and I'm sure what Phil's going to go on to elaborate on, is the links with nuclear weapons and the defence programme, and the need to cross-fertilise across civilian and defence sectors as well. But I mean, some of those concerns, again, which we highlight, obviously around technology lock-in, the diversion of investment away from the things we need to be doing, such as investment in renewable energies and a mass retrofit programme, just to put that simply. I know it means more than that. Intergenerational legacy, the burdens we're leaving for future generations. And it always strikes me that, you know, with the climate strikes in 2019, that was one of the things the young climate strikers were always emphasising, is that, you know, we were leaving this legacy for them in terms of climate change, and that's exactly what nuclear power would be doing as well. Obviously, there's the waste disposal issues, there's the safety and increased risk of nuclear weapons proliferation. And on the costs, we've already seen, so the first nuclear plant to be built in you know, decades at Hinkley Point C in the southwest. Again, we're told at the beginning of this year that that's now expected to be delayed, the first reactor there, until 2029 at the earliest. I think forecasts are more around 2031, and costs are now rising again by the billions to £46 billion. We know the government's already struggling with financing of Sizewell C in Suffolk on the coast, which itself is at risk of climate change. And as we point out in the pamphlet, this will be the first plant that will be developed under the new Nuclear Energy Financing Act 2022, which means a regulated asset-based model of funding. So that's where energy consumers and taxpayers will be taking on the risk upfront. So socialising the risk and privatising the profits, as we might say in shorthand. So, of course, when we go on from there, so we've got the cost issue, we've got the safety issue. Of course, there has been historically some major nuclear catastrophes, obviously Fukushima. where now they're dangerously releasing radioactive water into the oceans. We've still got the legacies of Chernobyl and so on. So whilst, yes, there is some good safety records around nuclear, they still pose enormous safety risks to us. And of course, the whole waste disposal element remains unanswered and still remains a problem. And I was just horrified to see last week, I think it was, some industry spokespeople talking around small modular reactors and complaining about the highly regulated nature of nuclear power, and that we needed to relax this so we could move ahead with small modular reactors, because this is what's holding back some of the investment. So in terms of the nuclear accidents, these are covered in the pamphlet as well, so I won't go into them here. I think the other side is obviously the links between the civilian and military nuclear power agenda, and which has been made clear within the government's roadmap to 2050, that these are being very much linked together now. And again, I'm sure others may go on to say more around this. So I just want to take the final few minutes, however, just to talk a little bit about the jobs issue, because of course that is the big question as a trade unionist, and it's the one confront all the time, that this means, you know, well-paid, highly skilled jobs, and that's why we need it. Now, you know, it has been said that these are obviously some of the most expensive jobs. I mean, Linda's going to talk about some of the construction side, so I'm not going to cover on that. But I think it's interesting in terms of nuclear power when we compare this, for example, of transitioning out of the fossil fuel sector. We have already got a declining nuclear power plants. They're due to be phased out in the 2030s, so we're not facing the same situation. There will be the ongoing unfortunate legacy of nuclear power for decades to come, which will obviously involve high levels of work in terms of decommissioning, etc. It does take away from other jobs that we need doing urgently in terms of decarbonisation across a number of sectors, including in transport and buildings, energy efficiency, renewable energy. So there are alternative pathways in terms of those jobs there. And of course, nuclear skills, in terms of some of the very high levels of nuclear skills, will be needed very far into the future. So I think, as we conclude in the pamphlet, nuclear power is a dangerous mistake, as we elaborate on there. And I think we have to keep up the pressure to get Labour to commit to end its support for nuclear energy. We're not calling for any worker to be made redundant, of course, and we would support those transitions within the broad concepts of the Just Transition Framework, that there is support for all workers. And that we also take this debate out more widely and obviously confront the vested interests that there are around nuclear power. And I think, you know, as we say in the pamphlet, you know, the debate on nuclear and its role in tackling climate change and energy security is not a new one. We've been here before, and in fact, you know, I've got a really interesting, very old pamphlet from the late 1970s about trade unions and nuclear power, when again these debates were happening, and actually the Labour movement was shifting away from nuclear power for very much the same reasons as we're discussing now. And we need to continue this debate and make sure we're having discussions like these, and to really highlight and try and convince as much as well, just to conclude, the environmental movement as well, and those within CND who oppose nuclear weapons, that there can be no place for nuclear at all. I'll finish there. Thank you.